Reading the Bible in a devotional manner has probably been one of the most amazing things that I've ever done in my personal spiritual life. As I read through the Old Testament, I'm continually reminded that the heart of man is deceitfully wicked above all things. And then when I read through the New Testament, the overriding message I get is the most important thing that anybody can do is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, how do we get from the heart is deceitfully wicked above all things to loving God and loving your neighbor? The truth of the matter is, it's impossible unless there's a personal internal transformation of your heart, of your spirit. And that is the story of the Bible. Greetings and salutations. Welcome to another fabulous day in the Lord's neighborhood and to another episode of Coffee, the Bible, and Page, where I drink coffee, read the Bible, and think with my mouth open. I am your caffeine-imbued host, Paige. Here is my coffee. All together now. In the beginning, coffee, and lo, it was very good. It was very good. It is very good. Today we're going to continue our jaunt. We're in chapter 8 of 2 Samuel. And if I were to title this devotional something, I would say it's, David finishes what Joshua started. And the summary, we'll get to it at the end. Of course, that's why it's called a summary, is going to be something that's very near and dear to my heart and one of the hardest lessons that God ever had to teach me in my life. So let's just, without any further ado, let's just jump at it, get at it, and see what God has to say. In the course of time, David defeated the Philistines and subdued them. And he took Metheg Ammah from the control of the Philistines. Now, in this summary of David's victories, preeminence is given to his subjugation of the Philistines, Israel's arch enemy from the very beginning. David had incredible success against the Philistines. Unlike his predecessor Saul did not have a great record against the Philistines. David finally conquered them and lays that whole business to rest. David also defeated the Moabites. He made them lie down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord. Every 2 lengths of cord of them were put to death, and the third length was allowed to live. So the Moabites became subject to David and brought him tribute. Now, this is puzzling to me, why David would do this, because the Moabites, Ruth was a Moabitess, and she was his ancestress. And the Moabites had helped them. The one time the Moabites sheltered his parents. So I don't know what happened. Something probably terrible, because this is a pretty ruthless display of justice of some kind or other. But we're not told what happened. But he kills 2 out of 3 Moabites, and the rest bring him tribute. So I have no idea what happened, but it doesn't say. But there had to be something that would allow David, that would make David do this. The reason I say that is because David's character hasn't been ruthless with no reason. When he goes to war, my dad used to say, he used to tell us boys, don't start a fight. But if you're in a fight, finish it. That was David. David finished his fights. And something happened between Israel, David, and Moab to cause David to do this. We don't know what it is, but we have to trust David's nature. David was not a heartless despot. He was a man after God's own heart. He was a man of war, yes. I don't understand what happened with Moabites, but something did. Moreover, the scripture says, David defeated Hadadezer, son of Rehab, king of Zobah, when he, as Hadadezer, went to restore his monument at the Euphrates River. David captured 1,000 of his chariots, 7,000 charioteers, 20,000 foot soldiers. He hamstrung all but 100 of the chariot horses. If I remember correctly, there was some command given in the past by God about Israel not gathering up a lot of horses. I don't know what the deal was. I'd have to go investigate that. But David kept a few of them. When the Arameans of Damascus came to help Hadadezer, king of Zobah, David struck down 22,000 of them, and he put garrisons in the Aramean kingdom of Damascus, and the Arameans became subject to him and brought tribute. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. It's kind of amazing here. After years of suffering, seeming defeat after defeat after defeat, running from Saul, having to live with the Philistines, and walk that road of pretending to be a friend of the Philistines while helping Judah, all that stuff that David went through. He's entering a period of his life where everything he does works. That's amazing when that happens. Everything came together for David. Everywhere he went, he had victory. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David took the gold shields that belonged to the officers of Hadadezer and brought them to Jerusalem from Tebah and Berothai, towns that belonged to Hadadezer. King David took a great quantity of bronze. When Tou, king of Hamath, heard that David had defeated the entire army of Hadadezer, he sent his son Joram to King David to greet him and congratulate him on his victory in his battle over Hadadezer, who had been at war with Tou. Joram brought with him articles of silver, gold, and bronze. King David dedicated these articles to the Lord as he had done with the silver and gold from all the nations he had subdued: Edom, Moab, Ammonites, Philistines, and Amalek. He also dedicated the plunder taken from Hadadezer, son of Rehab, king of Zobah. Now, here is a map. Basically, those of you who are listening to the audio version, you have to picture this. This is a map of Israel. And the thing that I wanted to emphasize here, and this is going to lead us into my thought of the day, if you will, coming from this passage of scripture. David completed what Joshua left unfinished. Joshua started it, David finished it. David completed what Joshua left unfinished in conquering the rest of the promised land. By the time David was done with all his conquests, Israel, the land of Israel, is pretty much the way we see it today. This was the territory of Israel that God had promised to Abraham. And David finally completed the tasks. And David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. He put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. The Lord gave David victory wherever he went. David reigned over all Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was over the army. Jehoshaphat, son of Ehud, was a recorder. Zadok, son of Ahitub, and Ahimelech, son of Abiathar, were priests. Sarai was secretary. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and Pelethites. David's sons were priests. Isn't that interesting? David's sons were priests. The regions added to David's realm through the defeat of all the nations, more than doubled the territory of Israel, thus initiating what we call the golden age of Israel history. David's new boundaries correspond to those outlined in the divine promise to Abraham. Now, let's take a look at this. This is going to take us to what I think is what God is saying to me and reminding me of something. This is the timeline of God's fulfillment of his promise to Abraham. From Abraham to the Exodus, from the promise of Abraham to the Exodus, 430 years, plus or minus. And they come out of the Exodus, there's 40 years, And then Joshua takes over from Moses. And Joshua's conquest to David's conquest, Joshua started it, David finished it, is 400 plus or minus years. There's 830 years between the time that God promised Abraham that this land will be yours to the day that this land was in the hands of his descendant, David. 830 years. I wonder how many of those years did people who read and understood what God's promise to Abraham was, I wonder if they lost hope that it hadn't happened yet. God promised Abraham this land would be ours, and look, these enemies, they're stronger than us. They beat us every time we look. They're stealing our land. They're stealing our crops. They're stealing all those years where people were just in these little villages throughout the promised land. And the Philistines would come in at will and steal their crops. The Ammonites and all the other Ite brothers, they would just rain destruction upon the people that were there. But God promised us this land. God promised us that this was going to be our promised land. I wonder how many people lost heart between the time that God made the promise and the time that the promise was fulfilled. 830 plus years. Some people think it might have been as much as 1,000 years when you add it all up. I've said this before, and I hinted at it many times. Between the receiving of a promise from God to the fulfillment of that promise, years could pass. In my experience, God has rarely promised and delivered all in the same breath. In fact, I can't think of one time in my life that he has. I know that every time he's delivered, every promise he's made to me has been fulfilled, but it almost never happens at once. Let me share with you my story of my ministry. I told you I'd share this with you before. Now it's time. When I got saved in boot camp, 1975. It was under the ministry of a powerful, powerful, full gospel choir from a black church in the San Diego vicinity. And in boot camp, they would bring in different churches from the community, and every week a different church would be there, and they'd hold a church service. So throughout the time you were there, you'd experience church services like from maybe Episcopal, Baptist, Pentecostal, Methodist, Presbyterian. And this particular Sunday, there was this black full gospel choir. And I grew up in Southeast Alaska, and I had never seen this many black people in one place in my life. And I had never heard music like this. Now, I'd gone to a Nazarene church when I was younger, but trust me, it was nothing like what I experienced that day. And I was in there, I was at church, that church service, for no spiritual reason whatsoever. I went there primarily because my company commander would not be there. He was the only man in my life, I think, that I've honestly, truly feared. And church was 3.5 hours away from him. And that was a respite for me. I didn't care what they preached. I didn't care what they said or sang. It was just 3.5 hours away from this man that I feared. So I'm there, and this choir kicks it in. Now, they had, if I remember correctly, purple robes and tambourines, and they had a full-on band, Hammond B3 organ. They had what I used to call an air-sucking preacher, the kind of go, and the Lord said, and every time he did it, the Hammond B3 organ, and the Lord, wow, and then the bass player thumping, and the drummer's cranking it, and the choir is singing, and the choir is bringing it. And I have never heard harmonies like this before. I've never heard music like this before. I remember elbowing my way to the front because I had to see what was going on. I didn't know you could do this in church. There was some choir members were doing what we would call the Holy Ghost shuffle or the Shiloh two-step, whatever. They were dancing, and the preacher was wiping his forehead with his hanky, and it was stunning. And they broke into the song, and I'm listening to this music, and my eyes are closed because, like I said, I've never heard music like this before. I'm listening to the music, and it's just washing over me. And those of you who are musicians know what I'm talking about. It was glorious. And all of a sudden, I realized I was crying. I was weeping. There are tears running down my face. And I didn't know why tears were running down my face because I felt amazing. It was incredible. And all of a sudden, I had this incredible sensation. Again, those of you who are believers know what I'm talking about. I had this incredible sensation that Jesus was standing right off to my right. That he was, if I reached out and put my hand, I'd put it on his shoulder. And all of a sudden, and I didn't know what these words meant because I wasn't a Christian. I knew I was a sinful man in the presence of a sinless God. And that the price for my sin was death. And in fact, I saw these words like a ticker tape go across my brain, in my brain. Depart from me, you wicked, to the fire prepared for the devil and his angels. And if the gates to hell had opened up behind me, I would have walked through them, guilty as charged. I realized that I was an enemy of God. And the wages for my sin was death. And at the very same time, though, almost within seconds, which I'm sure it was, these words go across my brain. But I have loved you with an everlasting love. And then I started weeping even harder. And this incredible sense of relief went through me. And my Pentecostal friends get all googly-eyed over this. But I had a fever flush that went from the top of my head to the bottom of my feet. It was just like almost an electricity. And I heard these words in my head one last time. I have a ministry for you. And to say I was excited about that would be an incredible understatement. I remember walking back in a daze, walking back to my company, to my barracks. And from that moment on, I started preparing for the ministry he had for me. Now, in my mind, that meant I was going to be a preacher or perhaps a minister of music, which is what we called worship leaders back then, a minister of music. And so throughout the next several years, I started preparing for that. I'd take correspondence Bible study courses, and I'd read. Man, I went through the Bible. I read through the Bible like a starving man would go through a loaf of bread. And I got the word into me, and I started studying. I started doing whatever I could to learn the skills that I knew that would get me ready for this ministry God had for me, which was imminent. I was sure of it. I was going to be a preacher or a minister of music. And the churches that we got married, I got married, and we started, traveling in the Navy. And the churches I would be with, I would connect with the pastor, share with them what God had told me, and they would disciple me to whatever level. And I started studying Greek and Hebrew and all this kind of stuff, just absolutely throwing myself into the time when God would bring ministry. And there would be several times along this path that I thought that this impending ministry was imminent, and then it would fall through for whatever reason. It just never happened. Finally, my wife and I are up in Whidbey Island, Washington, about 8 or 9 years later, and we're at this church, and the pastor's discipling me, and he's letting me preach sometimes on Sunday night. And I was leading worship in the morning, and it was, I knew this was it. This was going to be the time. And this lady in our church came up to me. Every church has a lady like this. Her name was Melody Tryloff. To this day, I will remember that woman. What an amazing lady. Every church has a woman like this. She has a hotline straight to the throne of God. She, at the time, was a widow, and she prayed a lot, read the word a lot. She had a ministry of prayer, and she came up to me and said, Paige, I've been praying for you. And trust me, you want ladies like Melody praying for you. And I said, well, thank you, Melody. I appreciate that. She said, yeah, I keep getting the word. God says, be still and know that I am God. I think you're supposed to be quiet. I think you're supposed to sit down and stop all that you're doing. That wasn't what I expected to hear. And it wasn't what I wanted to hear. And I remember going home that night thinking, Melody, you ought to lay off the coffee and pizza before you go to bed at night. These caffeine visions, they're not cutting it. So I just dismissed it. The next day, I'm walking through, this is Oak Harbor, Washington. I'm walking through Oak Harbor, Washington, and a lady from another church that I had sometimes ministered at, a lady from that church, she was that church's Melody. She came up to me on the sidewalk and said, Paige, I've been praying for you. Yeah, I know. That's what I heard. That's what I thought too. She said, God says to be still and know that he's God. What's that mean? I said, more than you know. Well, circumstances, one thing or another. I didn't listen, by the way. I didn't listen to that piece of advice. Circumstances led my wife and I to go to another church for a time. And in that church, they didn't know about this conversation between me and God. And I continued to try to minister, to preach, to lead worship, doing all that stuff, Bible studies. And circumstances led us back to this first church I was telling you about, where Melody was at. And I walk into this church, and they had a new worship pastor there, minister of music, excuse me. And he saw me come in. His name was David. And he says, Paige, I saw you walk in. I said, Lord, there's my bass player. I said, yeah. I said, David, I'm available if you need me. And he says, yeah, but he says, Paige, God says no. He says, you're to be still. What does that mean? Now, I'm furious. I get in my car at the end of that church service, and I drive home by myself. Glenda's home sick with the kids. And I have a full-out hissy fit in the car. And I slammed the dashboard with my fist, knocked pieces of it off. And I remember screaming, shouting at the top of my lungs, you promised me ministry. What about my ministry? You promised me ministry. And then it was like Jesus was sitting in the seat next to me, like that day in boot camp. And I heard him say in my brain, your ministry, when was anything of mine ever yours? And it was like you sucked all the air out of my lungs. I remember going home stunned because I realized that I'd taken something that was God's and called it mine. It never ends well in the Old Testament when people do that. And I realized that I had taken something that was sacred and holy and treated it as if it were a thing that I could call my own. So I remember getting up out of the chair after praying all afternoon. Glenda was sleeping with the kids. All afternoon I prayed. I get up out of my easy chair and I tell God, I get it. I took something that was yours, called it mine. It'll never happen again. I'll do it your way from this time on. I'm ready, God. Let's go. Well, the Navy transferred me. Through the next 10 years, as we traveled, the Navy took me. I ended up going further and further south. That particular denomination I was part of, I'm not going to mention it because it's an honorable denomination. But I ended up in churches in that denomination that were just nuttier and nuttier and nuttier as I went. And I'm a big advocate of my children and wife will be safe at church. And I couldn't go to that denomination's churches in the South anymore. And we ended up at the safest place for my family. And these were Reformed Presbyterian churches that had no need for an exuberant style worship leader, me, and had no place for someone like me with no degree, no pedigree, nothing. They had no room for me to preach or even lead Bible studies. So what was I forced to do for the next 10 years? To be still and to know that he is God. I learned that God is sovereign. I learned that God is in total, complete control. And to me, the definition of sovereignty is he owns every bit of my life. And I live my life in subjugation to his sovereignty. I had to learn that he is God. And I finally reached the point at the end of that period where I finally realized that I wasn't going to be a preacher, that I wasn't going to be a minister of music. I didn't know what he meant by saying when he told me he had ministry for me, though. And I remember talking with God about that. And I said, God, I'm not arguing with you anymore about this ministry thing. I get it. I'm not going to be a preacher. I'm not going to be a minister of music. But I'm still curious. What's this ministry that you promised for me? And I heard God say to my heart, you are not asking for ministry. You're asking for a title and an office in a church with a brass nameplate on the door. You have a ministry. You're a husband. You're a father. You're a friend. Fulfill your ministry. Now, if he had told me that years ago in that plan, I'm sure I would have been heartily disappointed. But the truth is, that is my ministry. I am a husband, a father, and a friend. And once I realized that, it's like this huge weight comes off my shoulders and I'm free. I'm free. Now, why did I go through all this, saying all this? Well, it was about 20 some odd years, probably. Yeah, that's about right. About 20 years before God revealed to me that my ministry was not going to be a ministry that's going to make me famous in the world. It was not going to be a ministry that was going to make me powerful and well-respected in the world. No. I'm a father. I'm a husband. I'm a friend. And I've embraced that ministry ever since. From the time God told me that in 1975 to it was about 1995 to year 2000 when God finally showed me what my ministry was. 20 some odd years from the promise to the fulfillment. Look at Israel. Oh, let's see, how many years was that? Let's take a look at this again here. 830 plus years from the promise to the fulfillment. When God promises, he always delivers. But I can guarantee you it'll almost never be on your timetable. David finished what Joshua started. Sometimes God's promises will span generations. In my case, it just spanned 20 some odd years. But it could span generations. When God promises something, he'll deliver it. But it's on his timetable. I'll close with this. I've said this before. I love the Chronicles of Narnia, C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. And I've read them through several times. And I'll read them again and again and again because they're delightful stories. I'm so familiar with those stories now that as I'm reading, if I go back and start reading again, and like in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, I want to tell the Pevenzis, look out, the Ice Queen is coming. You know, I want to tell them, don't do that. Oh gosh, Aslan didn't say. It's like I'm hearing the story and I'm shouting at the characters. Well, of course they can't hear me, but these characters are living that story one page at a time. But I've read this story so many times. I know it all. It's all now to me. I know how it ends. I know what the middle is. I know what the beginning is. It's all now to me. Well, how much more so God being the author of your story and the author of my story? He knows it all from beginning to end. He's written our story. We only get to live at a page at a time, a paragraph or a chapter at a time, and we don't know what comes next. And we're full of angst and we're distressed and God promises something in page 37, but we don't see the fulfillment of that promise at page 480. What? That's a description of the believer's life. God will promise you many things. He will always deliver on his promises. But it almost never happens according to your timetable. God is faithful. God is glorious. He's powerful. and he will fulfill what he says he will fulfill. 830 plus years from the time that he promised Abraham, the land you walk on will be yours, to the time when David's conquest finally wrapped all that up. Amazing, isn't it? God is good. All right, that's a good place to stop. I hope you're encouraged. God is a powerful God. He will complete what he promises, even if it takes generations to do so. It's his timeline. It's his promise. He can do what he wants. He's God. All right, here's my coffee. I'm Paige. Folks, I'm out of here. Have a great day. Bye-bye. So, what did you think about today's Bible devotional? Email me and let me know your thoughts at ffog@me.com.